thank you so much for having me over. It's been a pleasure to be here. I also attended some of the workshops yesterday, and it is really, really interesting to see what you are doing, and it was really, really helpful to participate in some of the workshops yesterday, and I hope to do some of that today as well. My talk will be a kind of direct continuation from what Martin Düring was talking about yesterday. So I'm also talking about historical digitized newspapers, and basically everything Martin said yesterday is something that I subscribe to, and it also allows me to save some time in order so I can go into concrete research cases and not mention many of the things that he did so elegantly. But I will say something about why I feel it is important and fruitful to study these historical newspapers. And basically there are two main reasons for me. And the first one is that they are such an incredibly rich source of data. You can find most anything in the historical newspapers. And just one example of this is something that my colleague Neshma Omari did in the NewsEye project. The NewsEye project started in 2019, and then 2020 we were hit by a global pandemic, and it changed everything. And then, of course, what many historians did, including Neshma, was like going to the newspapers, going to the historical digitized sources to see if you can find something that relates to this. And she did a small case on using face masks during previous pandemics. And again, it's one of those things that maybe you would not have expected to start studying, but since the newspapers are such a rich source, and since they are so readily available, Neshma could go back to the materials, find interesting cases, and write a nice piece about that, which you can find on the homepage of the NewsEye project. The other reason is something that Martin also mentioned, and it's the long time span of newspapers, and that the fact that they form a semi-coherent long data set that allows you to look at trends in basically language use. Of course, it's always important to point out that a newspaper in the 18th century is not the same thing as a newspaper in the 20th century, so the medium in itself changes. But nonetheless, the newspapers allow for these long-term analysis. And that is what I do most of the time. So I'm quite interested in how political language develops, and I'm quite interested in using newspapers to study how that language that is used in the newspapers somehow reflects changes in people's worldviews. So the graph on your right-hand side, I'm not even going to tell you what it is, but that's the kind of stuff I like doing. So seeing a clear trend over time in history. And I'll have some more examples later on. With this notion in mind, I'd like to introduce a distinction that I find useful in thinking about my own research. It comes from Juho Pääkkönen and Petri Ylikoski, who did a philosophical piece where they studied how humanities and social science scholars use topic modeling. Their interest was coming from philosophy. They wanted to know how people think about doing scholarship, and they introduced this distinction into topic instrumentalism and topic realism. And this distinction kind of goes through everything we do with digitized newspapers, I think. And actually, I don't think it's limited to using topic models as a method. I'm assuming that everyone is reasonably familiar with topic models, and if you're not, there are plenty of people in this room who can explain them to you much better than I am, so I'm not going to go into this. But I'll explain the distinction between instrumentalism and realism. So it could be about topic models, but it could be also about a number of other methods. For instance, just using word frequencies. So instrumentalism in this distinction is about using digital methods, digital tools, to find something for your qualitative research. It could be about creating a corpus, or it could be about identifying a debate. For instance, say a typical thing would be that you do a word frequency plot, a relative word frequency plot, and then you see that there is a spike somewhere along the way. And that might indicate that, okay, maybe there is an interesting debate, and then you want to go back and read that debate. That would be a typical instrumentalist use of a digital method. Instrumentalism in general is very explorative, so you use the methods in order to get somewhere, but in the end, often the proof you give in making your argument in that study is qualitative. Realism, on the other hand, is about analyzing quantitative trends. So then again, taking the word frequency example, it would be like the plot I showed in the previous graph. So it would be something that shows a clear trend, and the assumption would be that this trend is indicative of something that happens in the data, and that is the quantitative proof we want to give. Then it's another question how we interpret that, but basically it's aiming for quantitative proof. The realism branch can also be quite explorative, but there are issues with different methods being differently transparent, and I'll get back to that. Often, in terms of working quantitatively in the kind of realist paradigm, proof also needs to be statistically significant. But as in the lecture by Javier Cha, I also agree that sometimes significance tests aren't the kind of most important thing you have to do, because it's also a question of interpretation and assessment about how the results relate to the particular data you're using. I have to say at this point that I'm not entirely happy with the word realism. It comes from Pääkkönen and Ylikoski, so I'll stick to it, but I might prefer another one. But I hope the distinction is clear. All right, so keeping to this distinction, I'm just going to give an example from the NewsEye project where I worked for some time. And on the left-hand side, I hope it's on the left-hand side for you as well. You see a paper by Sara Oberbichler and Eva van Zelte, in which they use topic modeling to create a newspaper corpus that they can analyze qualitatively. So they use a machine learning method to, in a very instrumentalist way, get at something that they were interested in. On the right-hand side, you see 3 papers that are closer to maybe this kind of realist way, or this even quantitative way. Those are all papers I was involved in, and those are the cases I'm going to talk about today. So I'm not trying to put like 3 papers against 1 paper. That's not the aim here. I just needed the 3 papers so I can introduce them to you for the purpose of this talk. But before I go to those papers, I'll make one more distinction about perspectives in doing digital analysis. And I think it's sometimes useful to try to delineate between exploration, providing proof, and doing interpretation in doing digital history, basically. And of course, these kind of float into one another. But I like to think that in each research project, there is a stage, often in the beginning, sometimes it's surprisingly late, that is purely explorative. So you use different methods in order to understand your data, in order to kind of figure out new hypotheses, in order to sort of play around with your thinking and also understanding the methods. This is a really, really important stage in any research project. But I should also say that this is not the same thing as providing proof. So sometimes the kind of exploration gives you ideas, and then you work into the stage where you're talking to an audience and you want to make an argument. And then sometimes the kind of explorative graphs or whatnot you may have might actually be something that led you to think in a way, but they are not good proof of that. So then the next step is to try to figure out what you can show either quantitatively or qualitatively, that is, like, give some kind of facts that you can base your interpretation on. The interpretation aspect here is also something that I think that should be kept separate from providing proof, in the sense that we often talk about digital humanities in general, about the kind of why question, why are we doing this, and so what? Like, what is the new thing we are learning? And quite often people in the digital humanities, digital history, we are really good at then providing proof. We are really good at handling data. We're really good at also talking about the problems we have in our data and how to get around them and things like that. But then we sometimes struggle with are we really providing new arguments versus in relation to earlier research that was maybe non-digital or something like that. And I want to maintain that when we do that, the kind of new things we come up with happen in interpretation. So that's where the strength of humanities research is. Often we think that maybe digital humanities is something that brings in a natural science way of dealing with humanities research, and to a certain degree it does. But still, where we come up with interesting things, it's still in the section of interpretation. It's when we have our quantitative analysis and we piece them together with qualitative findings, and we relate it to earlier research, and we think a little bit freely, and that's where we come up with the interesting stuff. So humanities research isn't interesting without interpretation, but I also want to say that it's good to think about when we are laying facts about that come from the data, and when we move to the sphere of interpretation. All right, with those words, I'll move on to the case studies. Again, I said we need to separate them, but it's also clear that you can't separate the three. So everything is a little bit murky, as always. All right, the three case studies I'm going to talk about all involve different methods, and I'm going to say something about how I think those methods work in my own experience for historical research with historical newspapers. It may sometimes sound that I'm being like really critical of them, and that's not really the point of this. I'm more trying to say that they are better apt for some research questions, whereas not for all of them. So they have separate, in a way, properties. And the first one was using topic modeling. Here I worked together with Elaine Sosa and Simon Hengchen, who are topic modeling specialists. Also Lydia Pivovarova, who's a computer scientist, together with Elaine in Helsinki, was part of sort of designing the computational side of the study. And then it was Mikko Tolonen and myself who were sort of doing the historical interpretation part in this case. And the starting point was to somehow confront the kind of old tradition of being a good historian with the new tradition of dealing with data and doing data-driven stuff. So the question to us we started pondering about was how to be kind of true to the past and still be relevant to the present, because it's been something that historians have been talking about extensively. I have some quotes here that are relevant, but I'm just going to skip them a little bit. But the idea for historians has been that of course we always write history from the perspective of the present, but a good historian is able to somehow bring forward the perspective of the past and put these into dialogue. But this is, in an interesting way, challenged when you approach history through a historical data set. So at least in theory, you could approach a historical data set in a completely data-driven way, so that you're not somehow polluted by ideas of the present. Of course, this is not completely possible, but still, working from a kind of data-intensive or even data-driven way kind of challenges this old idea of historians having that craft where they can sort of talk for the present, of the present and for the present. So we were really interested in, if we take a set of Finnish newspapers, can we somehow get at the things that kind of disappeared, that aren't relevant for us today anymore? Are they somehow retrievable from the data, and is it something that we maybe forgot? I mentioned we used the dataset provided by the National Library of Finland. In this case, we focused on Finnish language newspapers from the latter half of the 19th century. And we wanted to do this by topic modeling. That was the specialty of Elaine Sosa and Simon Hengchen. And we tested 2 topic modeling methods, LDA and Ndtm. The difference here is that they deal differently with temporal change. So DTM is dynamic topic modeling, which starts with slicing the data into time slices and then connecting topics over time slices. We assumed that we were dealing with kind of discursive data, so language data, but we're not. It's been clear in this room already when we talked about topic models that it's not always clear what a topic is, but it's also not always clear what a discourse is when humanities scholars talk about discourses. So we had 2 kind of semi-murky concepts that we were working with. But still we wanted to try. And I'm going to just really quickly walk through some of the results. So this is the first thing I got as a historian, a visualization of 50 topics of the data over time done in DTM. And I started going through each one of them, looking at the words in each topic and looking at the salience of the words in them and how the topics developed over time. And as you know, when you do topic modeling, sometimes some topics seem very coherent, others seem completely incoherent. So I'll go through some of the more coherent ones. And something that I felt like, okay, so this makes sense to me as a historian. So we got a topic about education that was clearly on the rise during this period. And we had a topic on religion that related a lot to religious offices that was clearly in decline over the period. This kind of matched my intuition also that this would make sense. I would also inspect each of the topic by going through heat maps of the most salient words in all of the topics. These are in Finnish. I'm not going to start translating them, but this is about the religious offices. So you see there is some fluctuation within the dynamic topic model, which one would also assume. But what was also clear in the dynamic topic modeling, and it was more clear in other topics, that it does this kind of stretching that wasn't intuitive to me as a historian. And one example of that was one topic that was clearly about the Finnish currency, the mark, that was introduced in 1860. So it's a very focused topic. But there is the weird thing that you find this topic already before the mark was introduced. And I'll show you the heat map here. So if you look at where 1860 happens, you get the most salient words in the topic are mark and then penny, which is 100th of the mark. And before that, you have a quite different emphasis within the topic. And this is what the dynamic topic modeling in a way does. So it's something that I, as a historian, thought that computationally it makes sense. To me, it's hard to interpret this. I can figure out what happened here, but maybe it's not producing the kind of results that I'm entirely comfortable with. So then let's look at the LDA results just quickly. And here the results are similar but slightly different. I'll just give, I think, 1 or 2 examples. Here in the orange, you see a kind of topic that relates to public communication from the top down, and that topic is clearly in decline, whereas in yellow you see a topic that's on the rise, that is about civic engagement and a more of like a bottom-up. So in a way, this is a story of civic mobilization in Finland represented in 2 topics. So it's a really neat story. But then again, it's only 2 topics out of 50, and it feels a little bit handpicked. Also in LDA, I did a collection of looking at which topics were in decline, so I could assess them individually. And we see again a church religious theme. We see imperial announcements that I just mentioned, forests, and then some of the nature and agricultural related topics in decline. All right, so just some remarks about using LDA and Ndtm here. And one of the main things is understanding this kind of stretching that Ndtm does. So that, I think, was an important finding for myself in assessing in how much I want to use topic modeling and which kind of topic modeling to get that historical change. LDA was clearly more sensitive to ruptures in the material, so where we wanted to build continuities, the kind of continuities had to come from my humanistic interpretation, but that's where I was also more free from the kind of tyranny of the Ndtm stretching. Yeah. So many of the historical hypotheses we had, we sort of could semi-confirm. And quite interestingly, I mean, we were interested in these topics in decline, but it seemed like also using Ndtm and LDA in both cases, it was somehow much easier to find, and I didn't talk that much about them, the topics that felt coherent and then were also kind of on the rise, so they grew in prominence over time. So it almost felt like there was a presentist bias also in the machine learning method. I know that there isn't, but there is maybe something in my own thinking that also produced this kind of presentism. But then I want to raise one final issue with regards to the topics, and it has to do with my uncertainty of dealing with what topics actually are at a given stage when I see the list of words and what they represent. So I mentioned the religious topic, and at some point I asked Elaine and Lydia if they could simply take the most salient words in that topic and plot relative frequencies of those words, so I could get some hard facts on how, like count-based facts on how they are developing. And they were first a bit insulted because they are computer scientists and they were machine learning specialists and they didn't want to do methods from the 1970s. But then in the end they did that. And actually here is an interesting tension that to me, the results coming from the word frequencies seem much more intuitive. But again, I wouldn't have figured out to do this if I hadn't started by exploring the topics. All right, I'll just break for 10 seconds and I'll take the next one and I'll run through this one as well. This was done together with Jussi Kurumäki, who is my political scientist colleague, and we've been working a lot on conceptual history and the history of political language, and we've been working on ideology and isms. And we worked in this case together with Elaine Sosa and Lydia Pivovarova, again, because we wanted to do a computational study where we could hopefully prove some of our hypotheses about the development of ideological language. Now I'll just run really quickly through this. So what we were interested in are isms, so things like liberalism, socialism, conservatism, anarchism. So isms that are most often understood as somehow relating to ideology. But then, of course, if you just take the suffix ism, then that's a more broader phenomenon. So you also have religious isms, you have scientific isms, you have medical isms, and you have isms that relate to arts and culture and whatnot. And basically, why we find isms interesting is that they are somehow really reductive terms. So liberalism is something very complex that is reduced into one word so we can communicate about it. But often we actually don't agree what liberalism is. So I think in this room we can talk about liberalism for quite a while, and then at some point we'll realize that we're talking about slightly different things. And that's why they make for a good historical case to understand how notions of liberalism have changed and how they are attached to this one word. So we've been doing quite a few qualitative studies with some quantitative elements, but now we wanted to do something more advanced using digitized newspapers. And we had this idea that over the course of the 19th century, this vocabulary of isms really expands, and we wanted to be able to describe that in a better way than just saying that it expands. At this point, I should say that we used both the Swedish language and Finnish language subcorpora of newspapers published in Finland. The good thing with this is that it allowed us to compare within one country. And we did this in a way that we sliced the data into 20-year time slices. And this is quite important for the remainder of the talk. All right. We used word embeddings here, so a word-to-vec implementation. And there is one limitation here. So we did the word embeddings for each of the isms, and then we would cluster them together with something called affinity propagation clustering. But we could only include isms that appear 100 times or more within this corpus of 20 years. So this limits us to a certain degree. So for instance, for Finnish, we didn't include the word feminismi. So feminism, because it didn't appear enough times, but for Swedish, we did include this because we had more occurrences in the data. All right. The reason we used affinity propagation clustering is that we didn't want to choose how many clusters we would have per time slice, because we had this idea of the expansion of this ismatic vocabulary. So, you know, when you do topic modeling and you have to choose 150 or 5 topics, and that goes then constantly over the whole period, that was something we wanted to avoid, because we had the idea that this would not represent the historical development in a good way. So we did 2 things. We took all the ism words and clustered them together per time slice, and then linked them to one another. And in a second experience, we took all the ism words and their and similar words in distributions, and then produced clusters that would include at least one ism, and then see what are the kind of neighboring words, what would be the kind of semantic field of those isms, and how that changed over time. I'm mostly going to talk about the first one. So this is what we got. Each of the boxes are these clusters, and they are here in time slices. Now, the first page is in Swedish. So in the left upper corner, we just have one cluster with 3 isms. In the right corner, we advance to 4 clusters with quite a few more isms. So this is affinity propagation in work. So for the first time slice, we only get 1 cluster. For the second, we get 4. And then in the bottom half, we're working already with the 60s and the 70s. We get quite a few more isms that appear above the threshold of 100, and they are clustered in quite a few new topics. The fun thing with working with isms that they are quite easily translatable. So these are in Swedish, but I gather most of them are still readable to you. But you don't have to read them now. These are the Finnish ones, but for the later period, so starting from the 1860s only one cluster. Finnish publishing kicks in a bit later in Finland in the 19th century, so that's why it differs. But already when you look at the early 20th century, there are really a lot of these. These are the Swedish clusters then visualized in a Sankey chart, and this was basically what we were aiming at from the very beginning. And in a way, this is our main result also. So we start from the 1820s, see this cluster with patriotism as the most dominantism and then despotism as an exemplar, and then we kind of get to see this expansion of the isms field as a whole, but then also a clear, distinct category. If you look at the right upper corner, the four first clusters are these quite distinctly political clusters of isms. And if you go through the whole period, they kind of coherently stick together. All right. We also looked at the semantic properties of individualisms by using this second experiment, but I'm just going to run through that. And we also compared the ismatic language in Finnish and Swedish, where the main difference is that we had a lot more socialist discourse in Finnish, which is not surprising at all. All right. Again, if you're interested in the historical arguments we are making, you can look up the paper. It's available online. But I'll say something about using word2vec as a method in this case. And one major issue is, of course, that there is a lack of transparency here, which maybe wasn't that problematic in this case, but it still made me a little bit uneasy about what we can say is historical proof here and where interpretation starts. Let's put it that way. What I found really successful in this was the use of affinity propagation clustering, so we didn't have to decide on the number of clusters. I think that fit much better the historical development we were trying to describe. But again, there is some sense to lack of transparency in how affinity propagation clustering clusters together the isms. All right. Another 15-second break. I'll let you stretch a little bit. And soon I'll be through with my marathon of 3 cases and I'll get to conclusions. But all right. So then it's the final one. It's called Studying the Historical Semantics of Finnishness with a Bigram Approach, something like that. I might have changed the title a little bit. This one I did together with Antti Kanner and Eetu Mäkelä, who are like Mikko Tolonen and I from the Helsinki Computational History Group. Eetu is a computer scientist by training. He's a professor at the Digital Humanities unit, and Antti Kanner is a linguist by training. And here we devised a study where we wanted to look at the semantic properties of one word. And that is the word Finnish. And it's I think it must be like the top most boring thing to have a Finn talking about Finnish newspapers using the word Finnish, and it gets like I'm slightly embarrassed of doing this, but I'll try to explain why I think this is an interesting case. So the starting point is to look at the year 1809, which is the year when most of what is today Finland became part of the Russian Empire. So from having been part of Sweden, in a way switching empires as a part of the whole thing with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Now, we had 2 aims with this paper. In a way, we wanted to contribute to the historiographical discussion about nation building and understanding construction of the Finnish nation, basically, but then also to contribute a little bit to the methodological discussion in the digital humanities. And I'm not going to go much into the historical debate here, but there is a very long and rich discussion about what Finland was before 1809 and what started happening after 1809. And it's clear because there were Finns, people talked about Finns, but then of course there is this whole integration in the Swedish realm, which was much more organic, let's put it that way, than the integration into the Russian Empire after 1809. So this institutional shift clearly produced differences in how people saw what Finnishness and what Finland was. There's no question about it that like something happens, all right? So in a way, if our study is only about showing that the semantics of Finnish, the word change from before and after 1809, it's like everyone knows this. That's not what we were trying to prove. But we wanted to do this in a better way. Let's put it that way. So what we did was that we limited our corpus because there aren't that many newspapers published at this time. In Finland, in the so-called Swedish era, there was only one newspaper published basically, and that was in Turku, Åbo. And it started appearing in 1771, called Tidningar utgivna av Sällskap i Åbo. So a Swedish language newspaper published in Turku in the 1770s. So we thought, let's look at how they use the term Finnish. But in order to somehow compare, we wanted to look at the other part of the Swedish realm. So we looked at Lunds Veckoblad, who was another kind of regional newspaper in Skåne, Scania, that also had a kind of university focus to it. So let's compare these two. And then we also compared to some Stockholm papers, but it's in gray in the slide now because I'm going to skip that. And then finally we compared to a Turku newspaper from the 1830s. So a paper from the post-1809 period. So that's the main comparison. Before 1809, after 1809. And you see there's quite a few years from the 70s to the 1830s. So we wanted to make sure that we had more than 2 generations basically there, so that there would be ample time for kind of semantic change taking place. And what we did is we simply looked at bigrams. So we would look at Finnish as an adjective modifier and the nouns that the adjective modifier modifies. So constructions like the Finnish nation. But the important thing here is that, of course, the noun actually tells you about the semantic properties of the adjective here. So if you think of pairs like Japanese car or Chinese food, Russian poetry, Irish coast, you have all these ethnonyms, demonyms there. But actually they are slightly different. So Chinese food is Chinese food regardless of where you eat it or where it's produced, whereas the Irish coast can only be the Irish coast on the Irish coast, right? So the nouns kind of determine what kind, the semantic properties of the ethnonym or demonym here. And so we wanted to look at these couples when it comes to the term Finnish. And we from the get-go, we decided, okay, there are 5 alternatives. So Finnish something could denote geography, language, nationality, statehood, or territory. And this is what we decided we would look at. And the idea was that if we see shifts in these, we kind of also can trace the semantic limits or the conceptual limits of Finnishness, but also the kind of changes that took place. And the fun thing is that it does produce a Venn-gram, and I have one rule, and it's if you can do a Venn-gram, do a Venn-gram. So first we started with the 70s paper, Tidningar utgivna av Sällskap i Åbo. and compared the terms Finnish and Swedish. And here are some examples. And in the middle, you see the nouns that they share. So Finnish book, Swedish book, Finnish city, Swedish city, so on. And I started going through these manually. If you look at just the shared ones, you see that they are mostly about geography, so city, or then it's about language. So it's the terms book, congregation, and name denote language. Quite often I had to go to the actual examples to look at this. So I wouldn't only look at the bigrams themselves, but I would actually read the text to say, is this about language or geography? Then there's the question of the bourgeoisie or burghers, which is ambiguous in this sense. So it could denote state structures because it relates to the estate diet, but it could also be about nationality. And to a certain extent, it could also be about geography. So that's ambiguous in this case. Looking at, so I did a marking of all of these, also looked at the ones that relate to the state and to the nation and territory. I went through them and then in the end produced this graph according to our 5 categories. So getting a sense of the distributions of these categories for the word Swedish on your left and for the word Finnish on your right. And what you see when you compare the word Swedish and Finnish in this Swedish language newspaper published in Turku in the 1770s is that the domains of language and geography, so in orange and yellow, were much more present, much more dominant in talking about Finnishness than Swedishness, which makes perfect sense. So then if we compare to this newspaper from Scania, so the Lund one, which didn't talk much about Finnishness, but it talked about Skånsk or Scanianism. So we can then compare between these. Well, let's see. So first, the sanity check here is that the paper from Finland and the paper from Scania, so from the southernmost tip of Sweden, use the word Swedish in a like more or less the same way. The domains are more or less the same. Whereas if you compare the terms Finnish and Skånsk, the difference is that Finnish is much more often about language, whereas Skånsk is not. All right, and then if we move on to compare with the 1830s Turku paper, we can again look at some similarities and differences. If we look at the term Swedish, they come across as fairly similar. The perspective of the territory is not that present, but it was never very dominant in any way, and it was the most complicated one of our categories anyway. Whereas if you look at the term Finnish, we see that there is a decrease in the language aspect of using that term in the post-1809 setting, and there is an increase in the state aspect of talking about Finnishness. All right. So I'm not going to repeat those things. We see that we can distinguish between the discourse on Swedishness and Finnishness in the 1770s. We see that there is the comparison with Skåne in the 1770s also yields some interesting results, and we can see a clear shift, although not a super surprising one, when it comes to looking at the 1830s versus the 1770s. So there are some things with the method that I find quite useful, and the first one is that we were able to work on a quite fine-grained level. So as I started by saying that this is in a way a non-topic, because it's a clear thing that change happened, but I think we were able to show in a bit more detailed way what kind of change happened. What is also useful here is that this is very transparent, because it's quite literally just counting quoting words according to categories. So maybe someone does the same counting and ends up with different results, and then we have to have a discussion. But basically, I think this is very transparent. This method also scales down, at least to a certain point. So it can be used with quite small data sets, which is the case now. So just one very small newspaper published twice a week from the 70s for a few years, and then looking at one newspaper from the 1830s. These are quite small amounts of data. All right, so I'll try to put this comparison into a table, talking about the three cases I mentioned. So the discourse dynamics paper, the isms paper, and then the Finnishness papers. And I'll go through them line by line. I don't know if that works, but I'll do that anyway. So the first one used topic models. The second one used word embeddings and affinity propagation clustering. And then the third one was based on bigram counts. And there is a difference in scope in these. So the first one aimed at taking the whole data, understanding some major shifts in the whole data, and that's where we opted for topic models. In the isms case, we were interested in a particular set of words and their distributions. So it was already more focused in that sense, whereas the third case on Finnishness was simply focusing on one word only and like very delineated in that sense. In terms of, in the beginning I talked about exploration and providing proof and interpretation, so I'll come back to that a little bit. So the first case was basically very explorative. So we were really just playing with the idea of how can we in a data-driven age touch upon this historian's dilemma of trying to be true to the past in a new way. So basically it was about testing the methods. In the latter two cases, the explorative element was much smaller. We had a quite clear hypothesis from the get-go. And actually in the third case, I would say that you can't call that data-driven in any way. It was simply, we had this idea and we just want to describe the historical development better. So let's do that. With regard to providing proof, I think using topic models is often not a good way of trying to prove something, because it is very hard to tell what, it's not very hard to tell what topics are, it's just that different topics are topics for different reasons. When you do the topic modeling and you get the 100 topics or 50 topics, some of them are coherent, some of them are incoherent, but they are also coherent for different reasons, so they aren't really comparable to one another. So that's why it's really hard to actually give proof about what the historical change here is. In the word embeddings case, I think we are closer to something that's like reasonable proof, but there is the black boxing element with using word to vec in this case. And in the third case, we are producing facts about how many times the word Finnish was used together with certain head nouns. But of course, here are some issues with OCR, and there are some issues with the categorization, which can never be unambiguous or completely unambiguous. In terms of interpretation, in all three cases, interpretation kind of starts quite early. So with the topic modeling, when we get the topics, that's where our brain starts sort of, like we get these weird topics and then we try to make sense of them. And humans have like an amazing capability of trying to make sense of whatever results a machine learning algorithm produces to us. And that's what we do. And sometimes it works really nicely, and sometimes we just have to accept that, okay, so what we get is rubbish, and actually this is not a good method. But anyway, the interpretation starts quite quick early on. Also with the isms clusters, whenever we have had the clusters, that's where I was clearly moving to the the sphere of interpretation, trying to make sense of it. It was sort of beyond what we could actually prove, but it was what I could tell from the story. And in the Finnishness part, I would say interpretation already started when we produced the 5 predefined categories, which we used for categorization. All right. With regard to transparency, I've mentioned this already several times. It's clear machine learning methods aren't often that transparent. Count-based methods are more transparent. There are some issues there as well, but there is a difference here. And there is obviously a difference in whether or not these scale up or scale down. So many count-based methods also scale up in the same way as machine learning methods do. But that really depends on how you've designed your study and how much manual labor you have to do. In the Finnishness case, it was designed in a way that I did a lot of manual labor, so there was a clear limit to how much that could be scaled up. But had it been designed in a slightly different way, had the OCR been better, had there been better morphological parsing, then I think it would scale up quite nicely. All right, so I guess turning to your hypothetical research projects, which I don't know what they are, but if I'm in any kind of position to make some pointers, ask questions, I'll just take this from this. So again, I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't use particular methods or you should use particular methods. It always depends on the research questions, right? And it depends on the data and what you can do. But if your study departs from machine learning methods, my suggestion would be to do something similar than what we did in the topic modeling case. So doing that kind of exploration, for instance, with topic models or word embeddings, but then also when you know where your argument is going, then having something that is more count-based and more transparent in order to show something that you can prove. And then when you're kind of doing the interpreting, you're obviously using both the more explorative results and the more kind of empirically sound results to pull together your ideas and participate in the academic conversation. If you're using something that is very manually intensive, requires a lot of manual labor, then I guess the question to ask is that limiting your study? Is it limiting your study in a way that you are not actually available? Actually, you cannot participate in the debate you're participating in because you're actually limiting the scope of your study so much. And this links quite a bit to what Javier Cha was talking about earlier on today. So about this kind of focusing on one newspaper or focusing on a particular data set because that's the data set you have and you hand curate it really thoroughly and then you analyze it. But maybe that's actually limiting what you want to do and limiting the possibilities for you to produce an argument that is compelling to the scientific community. And in a way, I would also want to end by saying that to me, it's clear that machine learning methods are very good for exploration, but not optimal for providing proof. Whereas count-based methods are good for giving proof. But here the challenge is to understand what you're actually counting and how that relates to the kind of bigger picture you want to talk about. Because often we count words, but we want to say a bit more than just that the use of this word changed over time. All right, I hope that raises some questions for you, and I'm really grateful that you bared with me for this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and I will come forwards now. Are there questions from the room? I have many again, yes.
Thank you many interesting topics, what I will ask about topics. So you have a topic modeling, you get 100 topics, and you look at them, and 50 is incoherent, and you somehow dismiss them. Could you describe more this process methodologically? Because I kind of see it problematic why you discard something, and then even you can ask more. Maybe even topics which seem coherent actually are not valid as well.
Sure. So I'll walk you through how we went through the topics. So actually the first stage was that that we produced topic models with 30 topics, 50 topics, and 100 topics. And then Mikko and I started going through them, and then we had this sense that the 50 topic model works best for us. This is not like we don't have any kind of numerical say assessment of that. It was our gut instinct, and that was what we went by. So then we opted for the 50 topic version, and after that I went through each one of the topics, and both for dynamic topic modeling and then for LDA. So I looked at the most salient words, and whether or not I felt that this was a coherent topic. So I would give them labels, as many of you worked with topic models know. You give them labels that this is about this, and sometimes you get the sense that this is actually about 2 or 3 things. And then for the dynamic topic models, I went through the heat maps that I showed you. So then I would have the most salient words and look at how they develop over time within that topic. LDA is a bit different. You can't have the heat maps there because it's not, it doesn't have that kind of, well, it doesn't take the time slices into account in the same way. Now I wonder if I have an image of that. Yeah, so for LDA, I looked at this, I used this by Lda visualization, where I would inspect each of the topics. You see on the right-hand side, you see the words of that topic. So this is a language topic, topic number 33. And you see the most salient words, but you also see their prominence in that topic, but then also their prominence in the whole data. So for instance, if you look at the second word there, which is Suomi, but it actually can relate to both language, but also the country Finland in this case. And you see that being Finnish newspapers, it's really prominent out there. But you can see that that it's the language aspect that is present in this topic, whereas the other meanings of that word were present in other topics. So I would do this kind of inspection of all the topics. Now, this is something that I often ask when I hear papers about that use topic models. Is like, how many rubbish topics did you have, and how many coherent topics did you have? And no one ever answers that, and I don't have a numerical answer here either. So we simply, based on this assessment, we looked more closely at those that we felt made sense. You are quite right that some of the topics that come across as coherent might actually not be that useful, or they might be somehow, they might be somehow put together in a different way than other topics that are coherent. And maybe the example of this is the topic about the mark that I talked about, that there was this kind of, I felt that there was a chronological combination of 2 different topics in a way. But then, of course, there are no topics in history. Like you have that chunk of language data, and topic models is a way of ordering that into chunks, and it's a heuristic for us, but it's not something that is there for us to grasp. It's not something that's in the past. It doesn't correspond to anything that anyone in history would say that like if we do a topic modeling and I see that, okay, so this is a religious topic. And then if I had the possibility of going to the past and talk to a person and ask them to point in a newspaper which are the texts that fit in a religious topic, that would surely not match with what we get from topic modeling. And I think that's reasonable, because if we could, like if that was possible, if we could get that kind of topic models, that would solve many of our problems, but I really don't think that's possible. I hope that answers your question. I got into a long rant.
But didn't you use the topic coherence measures in the paper you were referencing?
Yeah, in the paper we had have a discussion about that. Yes, I can't come. So that's on Elaine's and Simon's table. So I can't give you the.
Many thanks. That was super cool to listen and to see the project in sequence there. What I was wondering is about the coherence of the measures you made, for example, for the ISMS project and for the discourse discovery approach that you did. Did you see variations across different newspaper titles? Because we take the whole corpus that is there, we run the analysis, and then we measure something. But if you go down one level and look, are there some titles that are more prominent, have more isms than others? We can speculate there. But is that something you looked into, and would it be worthwhile to actually descend on the granularity level and make comparisons there, and then to see the figures we get? What do they mean when we contrast different titles, perhaps different liberal versus socialist versus conservative, or even challenge these categories based on the analysis that you do?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a brilliant question, and for the topic modeling paper, we did not do that. So it was also because we played with this idea. Okay, so let's take the whole data and kind of just depart from that and see where it leads us. For the isms one, we did look into that quite a bit more, but actually no, so I'm not going to go back there. It will take me forever to click all those slides. But in the ISM case, it was quite clear that it had to do with different paper titles, and it had to do with language quite a lot. And it also had to do with censorship. So for instance, you get this boom in different socialist isms after 1905 in Finland with the reintroduction of total press freedom. So that's where what happened was a boost in mostly Finnish language newspapers and mostly socialist Finnish language newspapers that introduced much more language that related to socialism and capitalism, and then all the kind of sub-isms of those isms. And these I would then manually look at paper by paper. So it was also possible to see that that some papers were really producing this kind of language, and it showed. But it had to do with the political affiliations of the paper, but it also had to do with censorship in the country. And I have to say, in this case, we had a super good peer reviewer who really pushed us to, like, on the one hand, there were always these comments about methods, but then it was like, can you give us more historical examples? And I was really happy about that in a digital humanities journal, that there was a person like, okay, so we need more quotes, we need more examples from the newspapers, we need more information about the political affiliations of the particular newspapers. So I did quite a bit of reading, and you could see this element. There are also quite clear ism clusters when it comes to papers who produced a lot of religious content, when it comes to kind of topics like spiritualism and kind of isms that relate to psychology and well-being and something like that, that were really topics that were kind of pushed by certain papers, which also in hindsight makes perfect sense. Yeah, thank you.